Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome not to the lowland greenhouse, but the highland greenhouse today, where I've set up. We have a new spotlight for you guys today, and this one is a very special sundew that I have been trying to grow for several years now, and finally really starting to get some success with it. It's also one of the most beautiful and sought-after species in the genus as well because of its strange growth habit and, more than anything, its flowers. This is, and this is my very first in bloom one, Drosera cistiflora. This is an amazing South African winter-growing species that is extremely variable. In fact, so variable that some forms of it previously have actually been split out now into different species like liniflora and variegata, and it might be split further as well, considering just how variable in growth habit these guys are. So this is a species of sundew that is endemic to the Western Cape of South Africa. It's found throughout a number of the mountain ranges and associated lower valleys there. And as I said, it's a winter grower like many species in that area because in winter, that's when the rainstorms come through the area and drench the landscape and allow a lot of very interesting, unique plants to grow up. These guys, they grow in fairly sandy, well-draining soils alongside a number of other plants that also have winter growth habits and huge, often incredibly colorful flowers. If you haven't heard of plants like Drosera radians, I suggest you go look that one up. I've posted photos of the one that I used to have a few times when it was in bloom. For whatever reason, the Cape region of South Africa has become a hot spot for very interesting colored flowers and big flowers oftentimes. As you can see, this is one of the largest flowers in the sundew genus, and some forms even get almost to twice the size of this one. But these guys, they start off growth usually kind of early to midwinter once the soils have become soaked and saturated with the first rains. They pop up. They start as a fairly simple flat rosette of leaves that covers the ground, usually between 1 and 3 inches across. The leaves are simple, strap-shaped, covered in tentacles. And the coloration usually ranges a bit depending on which variety of this plant you're working with, from almost plain green with white tentacles to rich red all throughout. As the plant starts to mature a little more, it captures prey, gets the nutrients it needs, it begins to produce a tall, upright stem. And as you can see on this plant, the size of the stem and the number of leaves that are on it vary a bit. In this species, it may range from like 3 or 4 leaves before the stem ends, or in some like this, you might get a dozen plus leaves that develop as it's growing up. And these guys in this pot are leaning because the light that they're going after is slightly off to the side. But of course, in the wild, they're going straight up towards the sun, so they'll stand upright to sometimes over a foot tall, with those long strap-like leaves still capturing food. And then, of course, at the very end of that stem, you get the inflorescence. It's a terminal inflorescence. The plant does not grow any further past this, and that inflorescence has anywhere from 1 to sometimes 5 or 6 buds that develop. And of course, this species is most famous for its flowers. The buds start off, they'll develop over the course of a couple of weeks actually, getting bigger and bigger before finally the flowers open in the morning for either 1 day, sometimes 2, and wait for, it's actually a group of beetles that pollinate these guys primarily, and the diversity in those beetles is something that's actually driving the diversity and color of this species. Now, this is the first one that I've had bloom so far, so I don't have all the different color forms to show you, but this plant comes not in just this simple, quote-unquote simple, creamy white variation. You can see that beautiful like deep green center and black ovary, and then it's also got black stamens with that bright yellow-orange pollen. But it also comes in several other different color forms. The next most common is probably the variations of pink. It can go from a very light, pale pinkish color to this rich, almost fuchsia coloration in some forms. There's also a salmon flower version that's got a slightly more reddish tint to it, but it's still that brilliant pink color. You also get rarer forms such as the yellow and orange or red forms as well. And those guys, the yellow is a very pale lemony yellow color with a deep black center. The oranges and reds, metallic orange and red and brilliant. They look like poppies almost. And again, because these are big flowers, they are almost poppy sized in some cases. Not like the huge oriental poppies, but if you're familiar with like California poppies and such, roughly that size. And perhaps some of the rarest are the violaceas, as they're called, the violet flowered groups, where those blooms are an electric purple coloration with, again, oftentimes that black center. Now those colors are also something you will see in a lot of the other plants that these guys grow with. Again, the Geyserrhiza, Babiana, and some other species, they have these big, almost cup-shaped blooms. This guy, it did have its petals actually reflex downward earlier today, but it's starting to actually fold up. The petals are developing kind of a cup shape, and a lot of flowers down there have a similar habit because they all rely on that same group of beetles for pollinating their flowers. Now there are some bees and stuff that will also visit, but it seems like the beetles may be the primary pollinators for these guys, and driving why, even just in this one species, all those different color variations in these flowers exist. There's very few other sundews out there that have even similar color variation. The pygmy sundew Drosera pulchella might be one that I can think of, but there aren't very many others that do that. These guys are quite similar to some of their relatives. Again, species like liniflora and variegata have been split off from this somewhat recently. They've been either officially described or being reinstated as good species. And they have a similar growth habit that basal rosette. Some species like Passiflora never develop past that basal rosette, and they just make their big, huge flowers. Or Coxypetala is another one, another beautiful red plant. But then you have species like Variegata, which produces 1 to 2 leaves on its stem before its flower, or Liniflora, which has a much more slender habit and smaller flowers, but still decently sized. So oftentimes it's very small details sometimes that separate from cistiflora from its closest relatives. Now, of course, because it produces these huge flowers, it is quite a sought-after species for growing in cultivation. However, it does present quite a few challenges to getting it to grow right, which is one reason why I've had so much issue getting these guys really established and doing well up until very recently. Again, it is a winter grower, so it has a very specific set of seasonal conditions that must be met in order for it to, 1, survive, and 2, actually give its flowers like this. So when you're growing these plants, first off, most commonly you're going to find them as plants. Seeds are produced occasionally, but they can sometimes be a little touchy to germinate. They have to get the same kind of conditions as the adult plants have in order to sprout. So if you get a plant, it'll go through the same cycles. If you get seeds, they get sown on the surface of the soil. And the soil for these guys, again, sandy, well draining. So these guys need, I would say something like, say, a 2 or 3 to 1 sand to peat mix, or sand and perlite to peat. So that the soil is well draining but will retain some moisture even in summer, because in winter, of course, these guys experience temperatures cool down and the rains come in, so that's when you start watering. Day length is also important to kind of help give these cycles. The days should shorten as winter sets in, down to maybe less than 10 hours of light a day. up to 16 plus hours during summer. So those shortening days and temperatures dropping, preferably if you can keep them below 70 degrees during the winter, is the best. That will help the seeds sprout and it'll help the plants grow. If you can get at least occasional temperature drops to maybe down to 45 degrees Fahrenheit as well at night and such, that will also help really trigger seeds to germinate, and is also what will help trigger these plants to actually produce good flowers in some cases. Just a little bit of that stressor so that they're triggered to actually go through their full seasonal cycle. During those first few months of winter, of course, you'll want to focus on feeding these guys and keeping them moist. The soil should always be damp to almost slightly wet during their growing season so that they never dry out. If you water them from the bottom, fill up to an inch or two along the pot and then let that just dry out until you fill again. And then you want to feed these guys fairly heavily. They need a lot of energy to produce these huge flowers as well as to be able to survive through their next season. So feeding them with, these guys capture the fungus gnats that get into my greenhouses, so that helps a bit, but I will also give them dried fruit flies. If you have bloodworms, dried bloodworms, fish flakes, so fish food basically, you can give that to them. If you capture insects to give to them, that works as well. Or dilute fertilizers like Max C and other relatively urea-low fertilizers, high nitrogen, moderate phosphorus, to help these guys. Just feed the leaves. This is a species where you will often see when you feed them, the leaves are fairly active. The tentacles and the leaves themselves will curl in. Those long, thin leaves really lend to the plant actually curling completely around its food. So it'll often do that. If I bring up close to the camera here, you can actually see this leaf has captured something and it's folded over. So feeding them heavily, though, will allow them to get that strength that they need and then hopefully produce a tall enough, happy enough stalk to produce your flowers. When they actually start producing flowers, you want the condition to be fairly cool and stable. So temperatures, again, between roughly 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit is probably best. Try not to get over 75 degrees or so, if you can avoid it, and cooler at night. And then once the flowers are ready to open, you want to make sure that they are exposed to lots of nice, bright light. You should be giving them very strong light overall, of course, to give them best growth, because these guys, they do grow in full sun out where they grow. They're open, sandy grasslands, so there's not a whole lot that's shading them out above. So they want a full sun or equivalent, the brightest lights that you can possibly give them if you're growing them indoors. And once they flower, if those lights are dimmed at all, the flowers may not actually open. It requires nice, bright light in order to actually trigger these blooms to open fully so they can be seen and appreciated and pollinated. There is some variation, it seems, in the self-compatibility of these flowers. Best option, if you have the chance, of course, is to cross-pollinate. So if you have multiple clones, or if you want to try even different color forms, see what happens. Cross the flowers and that'll produce your best seed yields. Some forms, though, will self-pollinate. Just got to get that pollen onto the long, thin stigmas that these guys have. And then over the course of the next couple of months, the plant will put its energy into producing those seed pods. Keep feeding heavily at that time so that they're producing good seeds, but also so that you're preparing them for summer, because these guys survive summer by dying back to a long, thick taproot that's a couple inches underground. Now, you can see I've got these guys in relatively small pots here. I'm fickle and I regularly check and water things all the time, so I'm able to keep these guys alive in that way. But if you're someone who might be a little more prone to forgetting about things that don't need to be taken care of every day, it's best probably to grow these in fairly large, deep pots. Because that way, when these guys die back in summer, long day length hours and warm conditions can get up to 85, 90, 95 degrees. If the soil stays a little cooler, that will probably help these guys out, but the air temperatures can get much warmer, and that'll help kind of keep them dormant. And the soil itself, it dries out during that period, but you don't want it to dry out completely. Making sure that the soil is slightly damp down below will allow the roots to stay alive and not rot, but also not desiccate. If it dries out completely, those roots may shrivel up. If you keep it more than just barely damp, you may rot the roots out instead. So keeping it just barely moist is the key. In a small pot like this, that might mean dribbling a bit of water on it or into the tray every few days. If it's a much larger pot, that might mean you give it a spritz every couple of weeks just to keep there's a little bit of moisture down in the lower soil areas. If you can manage that, then you'll hopefully see next year those roots will send up new shoots and new rosettes, and you'll start the cycle all over again. But again, it's very touchy keeping them through the summer, and that's probably the most difficult part. And then keeping temperatures cool enough, but the conditions bright enough to trigger them to actually produce stems and blooms like this. Also, you can see, because it is much dimmer in here than where this guy is actually growing in the other little greenhouse that it's in, this flower is actually starting to become a lot more cupped. It's beginning to close up. As the sun goes down, these flowers close up, and they're done for the season after that. But certainly, if you can get the conditions right, it is a very rewarding and very unusually shaped sundew to grow. Certainly worth it, worth the effort for those pretty flowers. Now that's about all that I have for this species. If there's anything that I've missed about it, if there's any questions that you might have, feel free to leave those in the comments below the video here. If you're looking for this species, there's a few people occasionally that have them for sale, but often, especially the rarer color varieties, are still very, very uncommon in cultivation. So you just got to keep your eye out, keep your ear to the wire for people who might be offering them. If you enjoy educational videos like this, learning about the different species and such and how to grow them or so on, if you're interested in learning about the animals and the wildlife that I work with as well, make sure to subscribe to the channel, click the black bell so you don't miss anything coming up. And you can also visit the website, carltoncarnivores.com, where the blog and database are with all the files and information on the different plants that I like to work with. You can also find more photos and video tidbits and so on. I'm posting on social media all the time, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok right now at Carlton Carnivores. And if you would like to help support the production of videos like this, consider buying some plants at the shop at carltoncarnivores.com. There's also seeds and resin gem jewelry. There's some merchandise and stuff on there as well. Make sure to check those things out. Every little bit does help. You can also become a Patreon member at patreon.com/hcarlton, where you can gain access to the monthly seed contests that I do, things that I may not offer in my shop or that are fairly expensive in the shop, and you might get a chance at them for simply the cost of membership, $3 to start. You can also donate at Ko-fi or simply contact me if you prefer. Links for all those things, though, will be in the video description down below. But until next time, I'm Hawken Carlton, and this is Carlton Carnivores.